about to begin the first technical session this afternoon after the formal inauguration of the International Seminar on Kalinga Lanka, Reviving Old Linkages and Exploring New Opportunities, which is being held today and tomorrow. We are indeed privileged to be the host of this conference as far as this university is concerned. So on behalf of my university, I welcome all the delegates from our friendly neighbor, Sri Lanka, and some of the delegates are personal friends. I also welcome all the delegates, Indian delegates from different parts of the country, and the delegates from Odisha. I also welcome my dear students and faculty members and other members of print and electronic media. Mr. Lalit Mansingh, the president of Kalinga Lanka Foundation, was supposed to make the preliminary remark before the beginning of the session, but I think both His Excellency, the High Commissioner of Sri Lanka, as well as Mr. Mansingh, are held up in Governor's House. They will be joining us soon, hopefully. So in order that we should avoid further delay, we thought that we should begin the session. Actually, our Honorable Minister, Mr. Devi Prasad Mishra, Minister, Industries and School and Mass Education, was supposed to preside over the function. He may join us soon, but I thought that instead of waiting for them, we should start the proceedings because this is the most important aspect of this seminar. Let me make some preliminary statement. When I went to study history in Delhi University, my distinguished professor, Professor Parthasarathi Gupta, told us, and mind you, at that time, we were just fresh graduates from this university. He said, if you can answer 3 questions, you are a great historian. The first question is, why did a particular incident take place? The second question is, why didn't that incident take place earlier? The third, why didn't that incident take place later? Why at a particular point of time? Ladies and gentlemen, at the time we were just fresh students, so we wanted to be important historians. And we thought that, come on, if you can answer these 3 questions, we'll be great historians. But then the first questions, all of us know how to answer. But the second and third, the more we ponder, the more difficulties we find, the more complexities we encounter. When you are trying to determine the shared history of Kalinga and Lanka, the purpose is not to romanticize the past. The purpose is not to celebrate the past for the sake of it. The purpose is not to be a prisoner of the past. The purpose is to attempt an objective understanding of the shared relationship. What kind of relationship? When did it originate? How did it originate? What were the factors? And how is it that these relationships remain in our collective memory, but then in a very vague and shadowy manner? Is it time to drive that mist from that perspective? If I may use the term of the famous historian Brauddel's long theory history, I think the relationship between Sri Lanka and Kalinga comes under that perspective. Within that perspective, again we have to find out, to locate our analysis, as far as I am concerned, within an Indian Ocean perspective. Because whether it is Sri Lanka or whether it is the Coromandel coast of India or the western coast, all of us are to be situated within an Indian Ocean perspective. Once we start doing it, then we try to fill the dots in our trajectory. I think in these 2 days seminar, if we are able to add, refine, or revitalize some more dots in the trajectory of that relationship, I think our job will be more than over. Having said that, we have in our midst very distinguished participants from Sri Lanka and India, and we in Utkal University would certainly take the benefit of their expertise. And as the distinguished speakers have told in the morning, this will also pave the way for further enriching of relationship and formalization of such relationship between Utkal University and the universities of Sri Lanka. So I am waiting for those days, and I am sure our Vice Chancellor will certainly appreciate such kinds of collaborative exercise between Sri Lanka and Utkal University. May I now request the distinguished speakers to please come to the dais. Professor B.D. Nandadeva, please. Professor Sandagami Kaperehwa from University of Colombo. Dr. Lalatendu Das Mahapatra from National Archives, Bhubaneswar. Dr. Benudhar Patra from Chandigarh. Professor Ravi Mohanty, formerly from Deccan College, Pune, now at the moment based in Delhi Institute of Heritage Research and Management. Dr. Sila Tripathi from the National Institute of Oceanography, Goa. Distinguished speakers, I hope you have given your PowerPoint copy to our person. Would I say that because this is a long panel of speakers, it will be better if all of you could stick to about between 10 to 12 minutes most, and then it will be followed by a very eminent panel of discussants. For example, we have in our midst Professor D.P. Patnaik, very eminent linguist, Dr. Bimalendu Mohanty, the founder, Vice Chancellor of Utkal University of Culture, Professor Amiya Kumar Patnaik, former Vice Chancellor, Utkal University of Culture. We have invited Dr. Bijoy Rath, very eminent archaeologist, I'm not sure whether he is around, Dr. Sanjay Acharya, Dr. Sunil Patnaik, and Dr. Umakanta Mishra. I mean, it's not that all of you have to speak, but then, if necessary, you can come after the panel of this, the distinguished speakers have made their presentation. If at all you have to make some very crucial intervention, it has to be made. It is not that the discussants are to make another speech. It has to be very focused and very precise. So may I now request Professor B.D. Nandadeva to make his presentation. The session is Retracing Shared History, Kalinga and Lanka. Professor Nandadeva, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Basa, for that brief introduction. Distinguished guests, distinguished speakers in the session, and eminent scholars, and lovely gathering of young students whom I see like my own children. I am a father of 2 children. All my children are older to you, so I see you guys as my own children. It's very nice to see these very young faces who is waiting to hear from us about what we think about what our relationships had been between Orissa or Kalinga and Sri Lanka. Okay, this map, I think everybody who uses internet must be very familiar with this map. Not something that I prepared. It's on the internet, anybody can see, that shows the trade routes that linked Kalinga and Sri Lanka and other parts of Southeast Asia. Our relationships between Kalinga and Sri Lanka dates back to, many people think that it's a migration of Vijay and his followers, but the coming of the two merchant brothers of Kalinga origin, Tapasu and Balluka, were the first recorded relationship. Tapasu and Balluka were two Kalinga merchants. They were the first lay disciples, first lay followers of the Buddha, who gave some alms to Buddha. So Buddha in return gave some hair relics, and they came to Sri Lanka and enshrined that and built a stupa during the lifetime of Buddha himself, according to legend. So this is the first instance that we know of two Kalinga merchants coming all the way to Sri Lanka, which means that we definitely had trade relationships even as far back as 6th century BC. And Tapasu Balluka may not be the first Kalinga traders who visited Sri Lanka. Definitely there had been many Kalinga traders, merchants coming to Sri Lanka and doing business and doing various other things. Then we have this long list which everybody knows. Vijaya and sometimes when we do not have the royal prince, we got Kalinga royal princes to come and rule Sri Lanka, and we have the matrimonial relationships. I do not know whether Kalinga Foundation has any intention to revive matrimonial relationships. Some of these very handsome students may think about that, coming to Sri Lanka to have a beautiful Sri Lankan bride, and you too. There are many handsome young Sri Lankans there, okay? And think about that, and if you have any problem, please talk to the Kalinga Foundation. And first Buddhist monasteries, and in the sapling of the Bodhi tree, the sacred and tactical dispatch of the Buddha's tooth relic. I think you all know that for Buddhists in Sri Lanka, the most sacred relic is the tooth relic. And it came to Sri Lanka from Kalinga due to something in history. It was never returned. It was sent to Sri Lanka for protection temporarily, hoping they will get it back. But something that was sent for protection became the most important sacred object of veneration in Sri Lanka. It never came back. Please don't ask it back, okay? And the claims to right to throne, that is Nisanka Malla, that is Kalinga prince. All right. Now, as far as we look at history, I know today there is a tendency that we humanities people, we think we are the culture people, and we always think that commerce and trade is not our forte. We think that the commerce and trade always corrupt. It's not good for culture. This is not right. In the past, Tapasu Balluka came because they were merchants. They came to rule the trade there. Okay, and it's trade. Ancient Silk Road. Silk Road is not a cultural route. It's a trade route. It's a trade that promoted and propagated culture. So we have to recognize the importance of trade. That is why the Kalinga Lanka Foundation is hoping to develop trade first, and hoping that more cultural links will facilitate, the trade will facilitate more cultural exchanges. And what it happens is actually it facilitates the cultural links by spreading knowledge of values, worldviews, and folklore, and all sort of things. So things that we believe as right. And it facilitates spreading the knowledge of materials and technologies of arts and crafts. That is what happened when Sanghamitra came with 16 or 18 guilds of craftsmen, the knowledge of crafts. That is what we call arts today. Sri Lankan art originated there. Then the materials, sometimes the materials itself comes with traders. Knowledge of modes of art production, how to produce, how to carve something. And also the works of art themselves come. Something completely produced in India would be shipped to Sri Lanka or China or Cambodia. So therefore the cultural trade links is very important for the propagation of culture. But unfortunately, in our historical studies, the attention that we have paid to this Kalinga Lanka cultural linkages is very little. we know more about historical events. So the objective of my presentation or my speech or my paper is to draw attention to visible similarities of some selected items, selected genres of art, and ascertain whether these similarities reflect any kind of cultural linkage, because the similarities can occur. You may find somebody in Odia who look just like me, very similarly looking, but it does not necessarily mean that we had a common parentage. Maybe, may not be. So ascertain whether these similarities reflect real cultural linkages between two of us, and whether they are the results of, if not, whether they were just random and independent development of. That also can happen. Independent development, independent origins can happen, but the final product would look similar. Okay, now let's look at these three. There are the three examples I found. One is the Nagaraja guardian figure, or the Dwarapala images. In Sri Lanka, it's called the guard stone. And the use of the Tribhanga, or the triple bent posture. In Sri Lanka, until the 14th century, Buddha images were made straight standing. But in 12th century, the Tribhanga posture became popular. I will show you some examples. And then the third one is a very unusual one, the manifestation of the Buddha being protected by the Nagaraja Muchalinda, which is very common in Cambodia somehow. So these Nagaraja images, the Tribhanga posture, and we can say the god protecting cobra. How these things, these are these guardian stones. Some of these photographs show some of the two best examples of guardian stones from Sri Lanka. One is from Anuradhapura. The second one is found in Polonnaruwa, but it does not necessarily mean that Polonnaruwa sculptors made that, because during Polonnaruwa period, they brought from the previous capital, from dilapidated buildings. So they both can be made, could have made in Anuradhapura period. It looks very nice, very handsome young prince with multi-hooded cobra, covered by multi-hooded cobra. And with the Tribhanga pose, he's standing now. When we come to talk, we always are advised to straight upright like this. But I always prefer to stay like this, because it's very convenient. Standing straight is kind of uncomfortable for a long time, but these guard people, they have to stay there like that. Today you see at governor's house, in front of governor's house, these military people standing straight like that. Is that easy? Any one of you like to stand like that? No. But how does it stand like this? Bend your body at 3 points? Yeah. Easy. Somebody who had been extremely creative to think about, conceive this idea, the notion that God cannot stand like this. Okay? Forever, these people are going to be there forever. These people have been standing there for nearly 2,000 years. All right? Anyway, okay, these are the few examples that I got, because due to short notice, we had a very short time to prepare for this thing, so I didn't have time to do field work to get nice pictures, so I just scanned from published work. This is from von Schroederer's Buddhist Sculptures of Sri Lanka. It shows the cobra in animal form, theriomorphic, and the anthropomorphic form. In several examples from early to mid Anuradhapura period. And only one example of a Nagini. Only one example of Nagini. We all have Nagas, but this is the only exception that we find from Polonnaruwa. But it's most probably this was done in the Anuradhapura period. Somebody pulled that out and fixed it at Polonnaruwa. All right, so what is the connection? Now you who are familiar with your own art in Orissa, you will find these Naginis in half human, half serpent form, with multi-hooded or not, or single-hooded. And these examples I got from Donaldson's book. Donaldson was the one who did the most comprehensive analysis of Hindu and Buddhist art of Orissa. And also you can see their bent bodies. This is a comparison. On this side you have Anuradhapura Nagarajas, and on the other side Orissa or Kalinga Nagarajas. I can see a great similarity. Some of you may agree with me, it shows a great similarity. But snakes being used in art is very common in other parts of the world. These examples show the Egyptian art, wall painting, and in ancient Persian art in the middle. And this is from Minoan, ancient Minoan civilization. We call her snake goddess. And but the interesting thing is that these snakes are not found in the island of Crete where the images were found. And these animals, these snakes are common in Anatolia, ancient Anatolia, which means that it's not the snake who came to Crete, the Minoan kingdom, but the whole concept of worship of snake goddess. The whole idea came from Anatolia to, that's perhaps longer than the distance between Kalinga and Sri Lanka. And the last one we all know from the Old Testament, Adam and Eve been approached by the snake, so the snake have been used in many different contexts. All right, why? Where this came from? Why it came from? How can we explain? To be honest, we do not know the answer because we have not done any research on this subject. Why these similarities are found in Orissa art and Sri Lankan art. It could be spread from a single origin. It began in Kalinga and came to Sri Lanka. Or began in Sri Lanka and came to Kalinga, who knows? Okay? Originated where we do not know. Or it originated somewhere totally outside our part of the world and came to Sri Lanka and Kalinga simultaneously, no one knows. Okay? And why Naga was used? There are so many stories because people believe that the Naga protects ancient properties and things like that. But, otherwise, was it the sense of fear? Because the snake is there, nobody enters into the precincts because there is a snake. But I can hardly agree with that because this is a place of worship. The place of worship, you do not go to steal. Place of worship, no robbers would go there. Robbers would be feared to go to a temple. So we do not know whether it is a guardian or whether it was for prosperity. But the popular Sri Lankan theories say that it does serves both protection and also the symbol of prosperity, because it is connected with the other figures in the same composition. Okay, the second subject, the Tribhanga posture. Here you see the third. So for the first time in Sri Lanka, we see Buddha standing in Tribhanga posture. Okay, so not until the 12th century we did that for Buddha image, but you also the Nagarajas, old Nagarajas, so in the Tribhanga posture. Yeah, all right. Yeah. Okay, and but the Tribhanga pose had been used for other images like this Tara, goddess Tara, or Yakshini, we do not know, and it has been very common in Kalinga art. The Tribhanga pose, the two images you see, very common. But again in Polonnaruwa we see the Tribhanga image for deities, not for the Buddha again. And this is the image house, Tribhanga image house. It's not similar in structure or whatever to a Kalinga building, but there are some similarities in the whole idea of decoration of the external walls. And the third is the Muchalinda. Here is the Buddha, Muchalinda, Buddha from Sri Lanka. And here you have the Vishnu with the multi-hooded cobra, the Ananta. So we do not know whether there's any similarity, any connection between these two. This is again from Kalinga. So we do not know how to explain these similarities. Can similarities origin and develop independently, or whether they travel through trading routes? So there are these questions are very valid questions for future collaboration. And therefore, we recommend that we need collaborative research that we will discuss actually tomorrow. We prepared to do it tomorrow. And the last thing about, I do not have no images. We have something called the ritual called the Sunya Yagaya. It is white magic thing. When people do black magic, we do the Sunya Yaga to get rid of the black magic. The origin myth, according to the origin myth, no one really knows where it originated. According to the origin myth, there was a mythical queen called Manikpala. She was fallen ill and she was not answering to any treatment. Then somebody has asked a rishi called Odisha Rishi. So Odisha Rishi sent a group of Brahmins from the Vaduga country, but the Vaduga country is the Vaduga clan in South India. So we do not know how the Sri Lankan ritual find in its origin myth a rishi from Kalinga to order Brahmins from South India to treat, well, the Manikpala, the Bisava is not in, we do not know whether it's a Sri Lankan or Indian. Could be Indian, could be Sri Lankan. So it shows that the folklore is an extremely powerful tool for people to examine cultural connections. So these are for future research. So our graduate students are here. They might take up some of these things for their MPhil degrees. Thank you very much.
Now it's my pleasure to invite Professor Sandagomi Koperhewa. He will speak on Kalinga Lanka, the linguistic affinities.
As a linguist, I thought look at from a linguistic point of view. Now, we know that this origin of Sinhala, the one is the language, the other one is the origin, the Sinhala people, is connected with this, the legend called this Vijay. So what I am trying to do is focusing on this origin of Sinhala, and so there are so many debates connected with the position of Sinhala among other Indo-Aryan languages. We know the Sinhala and Oriya belongs to one family of languages. I am happy that renowned linguist, the Professor Dr. Patnaik is here. So both languages are from the same family of languages, Sinhala and Oriya. So what I am trying to do is to draw your attention to one of the lesser known aspects of Kalinga Lanka relations, that is the linguistic affinities between Eastern India, mainly Kalinga and Sinhala. So that's what I am trying to show is the links between, the linguistic links between eastern part of India and Sri Lanka. So we know this story, this Mahavansa story, which relates that an Indian prince called Vijaya and his followers inhabited and settled down in Sri Lanka in the 6th century BC. It is generally accepted that the Vijaya, the son of Singhabahu, was the founder of the Sinhala race, and that again the Sinhala language was introduced to the island by him and his 700 followers. So this is a story which appeared in Mahavansa and other chronicles. But the term or the location, the original home of Prince Vijaya is known to be Singhapura, of which the exact location has not been identified. So the opinion is divided. So where is the Singhapura? But you can see some of these places in the, look at the ancient map of India, the eastern part of Kalinga, and the places mentioning about this Singhapura. So where is Singhapura? So on this question of location, there are conflicting statements, views with regard to the particular region which was the home of the Vijaya. But we know some of the people in Sri Lanka regarded Kalinga or the ancient Odisha to be their original homeland. So in addition to these historical links with Kalinga, the Sinhalese speak, as I mentioned earlier, Indo-Aryan language, very similar. Just I take one example. If you take the term the Sinhala term for the tooth, we call it dat, but in Sanskrit it's danta. So what is in Oriya? Danta. So it's Oriya is danta, Sinhala dat. So this is just one example that both languages belongs to one family of language. So there are very lot of similarities. So it's not only linked with other Indian languages, but also with Hindi, Marathi and Bengali as well. So these historical links, and I'm trying to link the linguistic line to this. So according to these legends and other linguistic sources, Kalinga-Lanka relations are linked with the origin of the language and the history of the people. So there was a dispute whether Sinhala originated as an Eastern language or from a Western dialect. So this is the debate. We know this both the Sinhala and Oriya and other languages are Indo-Aryan, but there is a question among the Sinhala scholars, especially among the linguists, whether the Sinhala originated as an Eastern dialect, whether it's from Western. So this is the issue that I want to bring here in this important seminar on Kalinga and Lanka. So this linguistic and historical grounds. So then what happened in 1930s and 40s, the scholars try to find some evidence in the language, especially the earliest form of Sinhala language. Fortunately, we know there are linguistic records Sinhala as far back as at 3rd century BC. So the scholars have attempted to solve the problem of the original home of the Sinhalese according to the linguistic tradition. So a comparative study of Sinhala and with other Indo-Aryan languages show, so there is a link, there is we can find the historical and also the geographical link to this question. So what I am trying to do is very quickly look at this Eastern hypothesis of origin of Sinhala. This Eastern hypothesis provides a kind of a support to this Kalinga-Lanka linguistic linkages. When you compare the Asoka inscriptions and compare with the Sinhala, earliest Sinhala, so there is a similarity between East Asoka dialects and also with Sinhala rather than that of the West, and they conclude that the base of Sinhala was an East Indo-Aryan language, whether it's Oriya or Bengali or some other language. So another argument in favor of the Eastern hypothesis is that there is a need to examine the early Sinhala inscriptions. For example, the Brahmi inscriptions of the island, especially during the 3rd century BC in Anuradhapura and in other places, also reveal that immigrants from the eastern India formed the foundation of the early settlements of Lanka. That's the one argument based on linguistic lines. So what is important, I want to quote the two eminent scholars, Sinhala scholars. One is Wilhelm Geiger, but he is not a Sri Lankan, but he's a German philologist who came to Sri Lanka in the early 20th century to give assistance to the dictionary project, and also the D.B. Jayatilaka, the founder editors of the Sinhala dictionary, state that, I quote from Geiger and Jayatilaka. They say the base seems to be a Western. So the Geiger is a proponent of a Western theory, the Western hypothesis of Sinhala. So but they say the base seems to be a Western dialect brought to the island by the first Aryan colonists, but this base overgrown with new elements imported into Ceylon at various times, probably already soon after the colonization and from different parts of the continental India, chiefly from east, Kalinga. So this is what Geiger says, the most cited authority on Sinhala language in other parts of the world. Then immediately after the death of Vijaya, the chronicles speak of a lively intercourse between Lanka and northeast India. The King Vijaya's successor, the Panduvasa Deva, we know this came from Singapura. In the latter part of the Mahavansa says this town is mentioned as the capital of Kalinga. And on this point, Geiger argues that it was in this later tradition that Vijaya's ancestry was connected with the royal family of Kalinga. So, what is interesting is this account of the arrival of Panduvasa Deva, that's after the Vijaya, provides another evidence of a possibility of another second wave of colonization. So, this second wave of provides, is strengthened by linguistic affinities between Sinhala language in the early phase of its development and the dialects of Eastern India, that's Kalinga. So, as this discussion showed, just to summarize, so this legacy of ancient Kalinga is deeply embedded in the history of Sinhala language and the people. But what is lacks is there is so far no comprehensive study of the subject has appeared, and there is a need for a further research on this Kalinga Lanka linguistic affinities. So therefore, a comprehensive study of linguistic affinities between the Sinhala language in the early phase of its development and the languages of Eastern India, Odisha, and again, or maybe on Bengal as well, will provide another dimension to study Kalinga Lanka relations from a linguistic point of view. So I would like to invite young scholars, young Oriya scholars, to have a collaborative work with the universities, with the Sinhala departments and other language departments of Sri Lanka for a collaborative work on these linguistic affinities between Oriya and Sinhala. So there are so many references on this, but maybe later we can look into these things, and I am very happy this Kalinga Lanka Foundation, this initiative to revive, and also then as in the inaugural session that we pointed out, there is a need for a revitalize these affinities in future. Thank you very much.
I will now invite Dr. Lalatendu Das Mahapatra to speak about Odisha Lanka trade in the 17th century. Dr. Mahapatra.
I am presenting is Odisha Lanka trade in the 17th century. I have chosen 17th century for my study because 17th century is considered to be the peak period of Asian trade. It is said that whatever trade have taken place in Asia for centuries, it reached its climax in the 17th century. In this century, several factors coincided which contributed for the growth of a very rich trade in Asia. First, as most of you know, the North European mercantile power like Dutch, English and French East India Company, they came to Indian Ocean and they also participated in this network of trade. And in the 16th century, of course, the Portuguese came to Indian Ocean and they also participated in this trade. And there are also some other political factors also, because in India, the Mughal Empire is also in its peak period. And the entire India was conquered by Aurangzeb in the mid-17th century. And this contributed stability in its political system. And similarly, in West Asia, the Safavid dynasty in Persia and the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, they also attained stability. So all this contributed strengthening of trade in entire Asia. Odisha's trade in this period also reached its zenith. In the 17th century, Odisha was annexed with Mughal Empire. So in this process, its economic and political isolation was broken up. So this annexation with Mughal Empire, it also created a climate for trade. It is because it has been seen in Dutch records that most of the traders from Odisha, those who traded from the ports of Balasore and Pipli, which are the two most important ports of Odisha during this time, they are mostly the Mughal state officials. And these Mughal state officials, starting from emperor to petty Sikdars, they all participated in this trade. Most of them have owned ships who sent merchandise to the countries like Ceylon, Maldives, and also Southeast Asia. And apart from Mughal state officials, the other important mercantile community, we are the Gujarati and Rajasthani Baniyas, who also migrated to Odisha during this time, and they also participated in shipping business. Two very important ship owning merchants in Balasore during this time were Khemchand and Chintamani Saha, and each of them have owned at least 5 ships who regularly sent their ships to countries like Ceylon, Maldives, and also in Southeast Asian ports. So these political factors contributed for the growth of trade in Odisha also. And so far Odisha is concerned, though I won't say that really prevailed in Odisha, because it has been seen that in the first half of the 17th century, Nawab after Nawab replaced each other in every 3 to 4 years, because most of them are exploitative in character. But fortunately for the trade, the port of Balasore and Pipli, they were linked to a hinterland which was normally free from the internal disturbances. And Odisha also had a good hinterland in the district of Midnapur, and also Hooghly, Dhaka and Kasim Bazar. From there also cloths came to Balasore by ship. So these political disturbances did not affect too much. Of course, in the second half of the 17th century, the peace has prevailed in Odisha, and the trade also continued undisturbed. So here is the major ports and trade routes of Odisha in the 17th century. In the north, Odisha during this time extended from Tamluk in the north to Godavari in the south. And the port of Tamluk, of course, by that time had declined. And Balasore and Pipli, they emerged as the major ports of Odisha, which had regular trade connection with all the Southeast Asian ports, including Ceylon. And so also in south, up to Godavari, even though Godavari was up to Godavari, from Ganjam to Godavari, though it was under Golconda, but still in the contemporary record, it was referred to as Odisha coast because of its previous connection with Odisha. Previously for 500 years during the Ganga and Suryavanshi dynasty, those are the parts of Odisha. So in south, the port Bimlipatnam, that was also considered as a rice bowl for Ceylon. From there also, rice was exported to Ceylon. And now I am talking about Sri Lanka also a little bit. So far this Ceylon in 17th century is concerned, divided into 3 political parts. First was the Kingdom of Kut, and then Kingdom of Jaffna in the north, and then the Kingdom of Kandy. In the 16th century, the Portuguese first, they settled in Colombo. That was way back in 1514. Then they were involved in the internal politics of the Kingdom of Kut, and gradually, by 1597, they captured this Kingdom of Kut, and then also penetrated to north to Jaffna. And in this process, 3 ports came under their control. One was the port of Galle in the south, and Colombo, and then Jaffna in extreme north. So when the Portuguese captured power in Kota and Jaffna, the king of Kandy became alarmed. So now he made an alliance with Dutch. And now both these two powers, they now made war with Portuguese. And this war started from 1618. And then by 1658, the Dutch entirely replaced Portuguese. So after the Dutch came to power in Ceylon, they tried to monopolize the trade. First thing, let me say something about the resources of the Ceylon. In Ceylon, cinnamon, elephants, and areca nuts, those were their resources. From this trade, previously the Portuguese government and then the Dutch government, they made maximum revenue. So they tried to capture this trade. On the other hand, so far, after the Dutch came to Odisha and Bengal, there also they tried to capture this trade. And so far Ceylon is concerned, it depended upon its rise to Odisha, especially the port of Balasore. Because Balasore in 17th century was considered a rice surplus district. So rice from Balasore used to be exported to Ceylon. And it won't be an exaggeration to say that the bulk of the Ceylonese population, they depended upon the rice of Balasore for their kitchen. So if in any year, any of the shipments stopped or if the trade is disrupted, suddenly there was an effect on the price level of rice. So the merchants of Balasore regularly exported rice and textiles to Ceylon. And in return, those merchants imported elephant and areca nuts from Ceylon. And now, of course, cinnamon has become strictly a monopoly of the Dutch, because the Dutch did not allow any cinnamon trade with any Asian merchants. They collected the cinnamons from the country, and they used to export themselves. So what happened in 1658, after the Dutch capturing their power in Ceylon, they entirely tried to regulate this trade. So they made a monopoly of the trade first in textiles from Balasore, and then the trade in areca nuts, and also another commodity also they tried to control, that is conch shells, because conch shell was also demand. Sir, how many minutes? Just 5 minutes. So conch shell was also demand in Balasore. So what they now try to do is, they did not want to disturb this route entirely, because they wanted rice to be imported from Balasore to Ceylon, because they could not provide any space in their ships for the rice, because that was considered, the profit in rice trade was considered very low. And on the other hand, though the trade in elephant was considered to be very lucrative, but they were also reluctant to transport elephant in their ship to Odisha, because there is also risk of mortality. So what they do, they ask the merchants of Odisha and Bengal that you don't bring textiles from there. You just bring rice and take elephant from here. So this was not acceptable to the merchants. So they thought that instead of sending ships to Ceylon, if we send it to other Southeast Asian ports, we will fetch more profits. Because those elephants were also easily procurable from Arakan and also in Malaysian ports like Kedah and also Achin in Indonesia. And the textiles of Odisha, those are also much in demand in there. So it was found that in 1668, not a single ship from Balasore went to Ceylon. And when the Dutch factors, local Dutch factors in Balasore, they insisted upon the merchants, they refused. So hereafter, the Dutch realized that it is totally futile to impose any total restriction on the merchants of Balasore. So what did they do? They said, okay, you bring some textiles there, which should not compete with our own variety. So this much concession they gave, and the merchants, of course the merchants also bargained on some other items. They wanted to bring erica nuts and also corn shells, which was refused, but textiles was granted. So in this process, the trade was again resumed after 1668, and the merchants, it continued till 1684. But one of the results of this concession was that the textile market in Ceylon was totally glutted, because the Odishan merchants, the local merchants, they knew how to maximize their profit, which the Dutch did not know. So what again they did, actually in 1670, they introduced a safeguard that was called permitted goods. In that permitted goods, a document issued to the merchant, which goods they would take and which goods they won't. But to the merchants of Odisha, this permitted goods was not strictly applied because of this rice trade, rice and elephant trade. But in 1684, when they found that the textile market was glutted there, so this the additional safeguard permitted good was again applied to the merchants of Balasore. So as a result, trade again disrupted. But the Dutch again realized the futility of these measures. So again they lifted some of these restrictions, and they reviewed their policy in 1694, and they allowed the merchants of Balasore now to trade in rice freely. Previously, they are not allowed, they are not permitted to sell their rice freely to anyone, but now they are allowed to sell their rice freely, and also they gave permission to import some textiles and sell them also in other ports apart from the ports in Galle or in Jaffna-Patnam. And in 1697, erica nuts was also allowed to be traded. And then again in 1704, limited cinnamon, which was hitherto an exclusive monopoly of the Dutch, that was also allowed. And then thereafter, the duty on textiles was also reduced from 20% to 7.5%. And in this process, the trade with Odisha was continued by the Dutch. But what happened? In 18th century, actually, when the Mughal Empire was weakened, so also the traders also, they lost their incentive to invest in shipping business. Because as I said, most of the traders from Odisha and Bengal were the state ruling Mughal nobility. So now their income was also reduced because they did not receive their salary regularly with the weakening of the Mughal Empire. So the trade between Odisha and Sri Lanka in the 18th century, it was continued in a very reducing scale. And of course the trade in elephant, it declined completely because there was no such Mughal aristocracy who had demand in any elephant. But rice trade continued, and this rice trade also continued till the mid of the 19th century. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for throwing light on something as recent as the 17th, 18th century. I learned something from the Sri Lanka High Commissioner at lunchtime today. I asked him what is the term for rice in Sinhala, and he said bhat. So there you are. The similarities are there. Bhat and bhato. Let me now invite Dr. Venudhar Patra, and he will give a brief talk on early maritime contacts in the historical perspective.
Dealing with the first portion, that India being encircled by Ratnakar or the Arabian Sea in the west, Bay of Bengal in the southeast, and Indian Ocean in the south, played an important role in the maritime history of India. Not only in the history of India, but also in the history of Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. And Kalinga or Odisha, ancient Odisha, being a vital part of India, also was no exception to it. It also played an outstanding role in the history of the maritime contact between India and Sri Lanka. The texts which I have referred are different nature, like Mahavans, Dathavans, Kulavans, Dipavans, then some of the inscriptions, then also Chinese accounts left by Fayan, Huensa, some of the inscriptions, coins found from Odisha and also from Sri Lanka. So on the basis of these, I will try to throw some new light on the contact between Kalinga and Sri Lanka. So when we are analyzing the history and the culture of Odisha and Kalinga, then we are tracing back its relationship to 6th century BC, the migration of Vijaya with his 700 followers to Sri Lanka. And my papers will start at least from 6th century BC and will continue up to 13th century AD, when there was a breakup in the political cultural relationship between Sri Lanka and Kalinga. So Vijaya, the first historical figure of Sri Lanka, migrated from or sailed from the Kalingan coast or Kalingan port, that is Tamralipti. He belongs to Sihampura. Sihampura was the capital of Kalinga according to Chulavansa. According to Mahavansa, because of his nuisance, because of his misbehavior, because of his antisocial activities, he was disbanded, he was expelled by his father Sihambahu from Kalinga to Sri Lanka. So Vijaya sailed from the port of Tamralipti. But some of the scholars, they argued that, citing a word that is a Lala or Lada, which was situated between Banga and Magad, but wrongly they said that Vijaya migrated from Gujarat coast. It is wrong. Vijaya definitely migrated or sailed from the Odishan coast or the Kalingan coast. He went from Tamralipti and went to the northwestern part of Sri Lanka. Then he started the political dynasty or the political rule in Sri Lanka. Then when he became old, he invited his brother Sumita that he should come because I have no successor. So you should come to Sri Lanka and you should succeed me. But his brother refused, no, I will not go. So he sent his youngest son Pandu Vasudev. So Pandu Vasudev was the second ruler in Sri Lanka after Vijaya. So this is a route which was followed probably by Vijaya, subsequently by Fayan and the traders of Kalinga from the ports of Kalinga or from Tamralipti, from Pallur, from Chelitolo. Three important ports were there which had important or continuous contact with the ports of Sri Lanka. So it was the route followed by probably Vijaya and Fayan. Then these are the routes, because Sri Lanka also is located or was located in a very vital position, or because of its proximity to India. It has been mentioned in the Indian text Silediva. By the people of Pagan, it was known as Taproven. Then by some scholars, Tamrapani. So in different names it was named, but mostly it was known as Sinhala. Sinhala was named after the name of Sihambahu, the father of Vijaya. Sihampura, the capital of Kalinga, And according to Geiger, that Vijaya belongs to Sinhala family. So according to the name of family, whatever may be the cause, but Sinhala or Sri Lanka was named as Sinhala because of its close contact connection with Kalinga or ancient Odisha. Then Sri Lanka played an important role in the west and the eastern contact because all the sailors, all the merchants coming from west and proceeding towards southeast, Java, Sumatra, Bali, Borneo, etc., and also vice versa, coming back, they were following, they were touching the coast of Sri Lanka. You can see that the sea route from the western countries to Southeast Asia. Next is, this is the map of Sri Lanka, ancient map. This is the present map of Sri Lanka. Then this is another route, Kulpath. It was known as Kulpath because there was no mariner compass. There is no direction. There is no idea about the sea route to the sailors. So they were taking the Disakak, the shore sighting bars in their ships. But mostly they were preferring the coastal route. Along the coast they were going. Only the mid-ocean route or across the Bay of Bengal route became popular for the first time during 2nd century AD, during the time of Ptolemy, who was referred from Palur to Southeast Asia. There was a direct route, and second time it was referred by Huensa from Tamralipti to Southeast Asia. So this was a Kulapath, or it was very popular during the ancient period. Then the two important religions of Sinhala, like the Buddhism, Hinduism, two communities like the Sinhalese and the Tamilis, they went from India and they had the Indian origin in general, and so far as Buddhism is concerned, their origin or their ancestry they can trace to Kalinga. Then according to Mahavansa, I told that Vijaya went there, and in Ajanta painting there is a scene that how Vijaya was going along with different animals and 700 followers. I don't know what, but the implication of whether he went along with horse, elephant, but he went according to Mahavans with 700 followers. And Vijaya landed at Lanka on the day when Buddha went into Nirvana. On the day of Nirvana, Vijaya landed. So there is no confusion. The century was the 5th century. In 5th century BC, Buddha died, and in 5th century BC, Vijaya reached Sri Lanka or landed in Sri Lanka. Then the Sri Lankan kings who had the Kalingan origin, they were so proud of Kalinga. They claimed that we are the descendants of Kalinga Chakravarti Vansha. In Allahabad pillar inscription, Samudragupta has written Lichavi Dahutra because he highlighted the family of his mother. So now here the Sri Lankan kings, they are so proud of the Kalingan origin. They said that we belongs to Kalinga Chakravarti Vansha. Then King Nisankamal of Shilan says in his inscription that he was the son of Sri Jayagop of Kalinga Chakravarti dynasty ruling at Sinhapura. Then matrimonial alliance also played an important role, because matrimony or marriage alliance, cemented the bond between the two families, between the two countries. It was the most important instrument used during the time of the ancient period, particularly by the Guptas. So Sri Lankan rulers, they also materialized, or the Kalingan people, they also involved in matrimonial alliance with the kings, royal families of Sri Lanka. For example, Sinhalese King Mahendra IV, Srisanga Bodhi, he had a Kalingan princess as his queen. The relatives of this Kalingan princess emerged as a force in the political power making in Sri Lanka. Then Sena V became the successor, who was the son of a Kalingan princess, Mahendra V. Then like this, Chulavansha also states that Vijaya Bahu of Shilan, who belongs to 11th century AD, he married a charming young princess of Kalinga known as Trailakya Sundari, the beauty of the three worlds. Not only this, the Kalingan princess, along with this marriage, 3 Kalingan princes like Madhukarna Dev, Bhimraj, Balatkar, they went from Sinhapura to Ceylon, who played an important role in the politics of Sri Lanka. Then Vijay Bahu's marriage with a princess of Kalinga seems to have been motivated by the political intentions. Because in Odisha, or in Kalinga, Chodaganga Dev, Ganga dynasty was ruling. And you know, Ganga dynasty was known as the golden period in the history of Odisha. So because of this political consideration, perhaps Vijay Bahu was married Trailaka Sundari, a princess of the Ganga dynasty, to cement, to augment the power, the prestige of Sri Lanka. So he was a contemporary of Ananga Bhima Chodaganga Deva. So it has its political consideration. Then Bikram Bahu, the son of Vijay Bahu and of Trailakya Sundari, he also married a Kalingan princess, Sundari Devi or Sundar Mahadevi. And he also, she was a relative of Madhukarna Dev, Bhimaraj, Balatkar. Subsequently, Sundari Mahadevi in Divangala, she has mentioned that Kalingalana, Kalinga cave, she painted or named that painting at Kalingalan or Kalinga cave after the name of Kalinga. Then Bikram Bhaus, Sundara Mahadevi's son Gaja Bhau, he also succeeded to throne in Sri Lanka. Then subsequently Gaja Bahu invited a prince of Sri Lanka, Kalinga to become the successor. Subsequently Parakram Bahu, also a grandson of Trailaka Sundari, he ruled over Sri Lanka. So in this way, matrimonial alliance played an important role in cementing the relationship between Kalinga and Sri Lanka. Subsequently, Nisanka Mal played an important role, and he established a Kalinga Udyan, Kalinga born in Sri Lanka, in memory, in commemoration of Kalinga or his relationship with Kalinga. Then subsequently, Magha, another important ruler who had Kalinga origin, he also ruled over Sri Lanka. But he was very rude. He was a strong ruler, and some of the scholars, they criticize him as a cruel man, an oppressor. But that was the necessity of that time. That time or during that period, there was anarchy, chaotic condition in Sri Lanka. So the strong rule, the oppressive rule, the very strong rule was necessary, and he applied that, he solved that problem. But after that, there was a decline in the political relationship. So in brief, this is regarding political relationship. Then next is why the relationship declined, because of the infighting among the Kalingan people. Okay, sir. Then next is religious and cultural relationship. You know that Ashoka invaded Kalinga because Kalinga was a maritime power. It was very powerful so far as maritime trade was concerned. His intention was to capture the ports of Kalinga, because how could we enter into the Bay of Bengal? So he conquered Kalinga only to get the possession of the ports of Kalinga. And from the Kalingan port Tamralipte, Ashok sent his son Mahinda or Mahindra to Sri Lanka, who converted Sri Lankan king Tisa into Buddhism, and Mahendra started the first Mahavihar in Sri Lanka. Also he started the first stup in Sri Lanka. Subsequently, according to Samanta Pasadika, that Sanghamitra went to Sri Lanka, she also converted the Queen Anula of Sri Lanka, and she converted some other women of the royal family, which started the system of nunnery in Sri Lanka. Then subsequently, we know that Dantkumar of the Prince of Ujjain, Hemamala, the princess of Kalinga, they went to Sri Lanka from the port of Palur, not from the port of Tamralipte. They went there during the time of Guhasiva to provide protection to the tooth relic of Buddha, which has been nowadays worshipped at Kandy. Then Agabodhi and some other rulers of Odisha, they went to Sri Lanka in connection of religious contact, and they spent their time there. So far as cultural contact is also concerned, the language, Pali language, Prakriti language, according to some scholars, also went from Odisha. because there is a similarity between the language of the Hathigumpha inscription and the Pali language, sorry, Prakriti language of Sri Lanka, and the Pali language of Ashokan inscription at Dhauli and the Pali language of Sri Lanka. So similarly, in economic aspect, there was a close relationship between Kalinga and Sri Lanka, because the Kalingans, they were exporting pepper, betel nut, ivory, drugs there, and they were importing pearl, gold, silver, copper, because it has been mentioned in the accounts of Megasthenes that in the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka was number one so far as pearl fishing is or pearl production is concerned. Not only this, which Mansings are told in the morning, Lanka Marich, Lankam, these names came from Sri Lanka, because capsicum we are calling Simla Mirch, because it is plentifully available in Simla. Similarly, Lankam, Lanka Marich, these concepts, other concepts which I have been mentioned in my book, Maritime Trade and Overseas Activities of All India, Odishan Perspective, a very big book. In that book I have mentioned everything. So last is the monsoon wind, how they were following the routes. So in connection of the transportation of tooth relic from Kalinga to Lanka, K.C. Panigrahi, one of the renowned historians, he cited an example. This is a sculpture piece now preserved in the Odisha State Museum, collected from Brahmeshwar temple in Bhubaneswar, and he says two persons are sitting in the middle. One, he said, one is Kalinga Princess Hemamala, second person, the male, was Dant Kumar. But it is debatable. But this is his presentation that they were might have transporting, and along with this, two elephants are there. So some people said that elephant, because Kalinga was very famous in ancient time because of for the production of best quality of elephants. You know, Periplus of the Irathian Sea, in his report he said that Bosare or Dosarinik, which was very famous for the production of elephant, that belongs to Congo the region, Ganjab region of Odisha. Not only this, so far as the trade wind is concerned, this is a Sri Lankan coin, Sahasamalsa coin discovered from Manikipatna excavation. These are other things. Then Kalinga imported pearl, silver, copper from Sri Lanka. Then last is sea route monsoon wind. In this connection, I have mentioned in my book, also in my paper, that the Kalingan sailors, merchants, they were following two monsoon winds. One is southwest, another is a northeast. Southwest monsoon blows during the time June, July, August, September. And the northeast monsoon, that is a trade wind or the retreat monsoon, blows from the period that is October, November, December. And scientifically, if you can say, if we compare the festivals of Odisha, like two festivals, Khudrukuni falling in the month of Bhadrav, second is Kartika Boit Bandhan, this month we will celebrate. So if you observe this, Khudrukuni Osa, observed on every Sunday of the month of Bhadrav, August, September, that marked the return journey of the sailors. Because of the Taupoi episode, the people, the Sadhava or the women of Odisha, they were gladly anticipating the return journey of their near and dear. So Taupoi episode is the medium, just a symbolic, that marked the return of the merchants of Kalinga from Sri Lanka, particularly and generally from Southeast Asia. Number two, during the Kartik Purnima, Boita Bandhan Day, October, November, December, these sailors, they are starting their voyage because Aka Ma Boi Panagua Thoi Panagua Tor Masika Dharma Mor. We are calling this Aka Ma Asad, Kartik, Magh, Baisakh, 4 sacred months of the Hindus. And during this period, they are chanting this, and with gladness, they are giving farewell to their near and dear across the sea or in the river. So in this way, northeast monsoon marked the the beginning of the journey, and the southwest monsoon or during the period of June to September marked the return journey, and also wave and the water movement and others, they also help this. So one minute, sir, regarding the Sadhav. Who are the Sadhavas? Because Upendra Bhanja, in his book Lavanyavati, which belongs to 17th century AD, he has written that Bahitra Lagilasi Sinhala Dipare, Sadhava Juvati Bani Ati Pramodare. So say, who are the Sadhavas? Sadhava was not a caste, it was a community. Sadhavas, they were not belongs to Vaishya community only. The people who are involved in the maritime trade, because it was a prospective, sometimes it was also very loss they had to bear, but most of the times it was prospective. So the people belonging to different castes, they were interested towards the maritime trade. So Sadhav community, it was a community, it was not a caste. So along with these points, that we can say that Kalinga had intimate relationship with Sri Lanka. In the fifth aspect, it is my view that there should be protection of the heritage sites, both of Kalinga and also Sri Lanka. Number two, there should be bilateral cultural relations, promotion of the bilateral cultural relationship. Number three, conduct of seminars, conferences, symposiums regularly to revive the relationship or to retrace the relationship between Kalinga and Sri Lanka. Number four, publication of the proceedings. Number three, other aspects. So we should try to promote tourism, to promote cultural interaction, and to promote the link, revive the linkage or the cultural linkage between Kalinga, Sri Lanka in particular, India and Sri Lanka in general. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Venudhar Patra, for that very enlightening presentation. Now I'd like to invite Professor R.K. Mohanty from the Delhi Institute of Heritage Research and Management. Dr. Mohanty will talk about recent excavations in ancient Kalinga and Sri Lanka and their cultural interrelationship.
I have excavated sites in Sri Lanka and I have excavated sites in Kalinga or Orissa. I have been excavating since last 12 years in Orissa, at least about 7-8 sites I have been excavated. Some of the sites are quite well known to all of you: Shishpalgarh, Manikpatna, Golbai Sasan, Tadpada, Lathi, and also some of the Neolithic sites like Harirajpur, etc. with Kishrabasa and other people. So I'll go rapidly to show you that exactly what archaeology tells you, because we have been hearing about the literature, a kind of descriptions coming from various sources and kind of thing, but real artifacts which comes from our excavations, and we see them. You know, first of all, when we look into the kind of relationship with any part of the world, we had to have a political stability or kind of situation which gives us scope to interact with the other people. You can see the Indian subcontinent, but the red patch is Kalinga. When I am looking into the period when the Mauryan dynasty had expanded, why they didn't touch the Kalinga which was close to them, and waited till whether our archaeology, our cultural past suggests something that it was not possible for Chandragupta Maurya or Bindusara, even Ashoka also didn't defeat Kalinga and left unconquered. Whether our cultural heritage suggests that. This is where we have some of the early cities. We were knowing three major cities: Radhanagar, Shishpalgarh, Jaugarh, and later on, when I was working, so we discovered few of the cities which were absolutely unknown, and they will tell you what we were once upon a time as Kalinga was. These are the cities located in the red dots, shows They are the early cities, early historical cities in the Kalinga region. So this is Radhanagar. This is a kind of fortified city in Cuttack district itself. I'm not going to into detail. So then Shishupalgarh, it's a fortified, one of the most best preserved city in anywhere in the country. Then I discovered the site of Talpada, which you can see, and the next city which I discovered is Lati. It's Talpada is close to Khorda, and Lati is close to Barampur. So these large cities, it is a kind of, now when we look into the city development and the kind of urbanization in our part of this world, then we realize that what Modi ji is talking about smart cities. We had those smart cities in 8th century BC, nowhere known anywhere in the world. Even the Roman empires were not having that. We have exactly same kind of thing. If you put the Lati and Talpada on the kind of map, exactly they are oriented, their size, their architecture, their layout is absolutely same. This is what I am showing to you because to highlight that what kind of cultural attainment we had done. Again, exactly in all proportions. If you see that, I am not going into details, but really striking is that exactly all the provisions what a larger city should have was having in the smaller cities. This is 1/4 size of Shishupalgarh. Shishupalgarh is about 1.2 kilometer in the diameter, but these cities are about 560 meters exactly, and have got 4 tanks in 4 corners, central tank, 4 gateways, the moat, everything whatever is needed, and close to the river for the trading purposes. You can see that all the cities had river connectivity or connected to the sea or to the Chilka Lake. This is Lati exactly. You can see that nowhere it can be seen anywhere in the world also has been given this kind of cities, so that looking to this we get to see that Asoka or in the Chandragupta, the Mauryan dynasty was never in a position to conquer. And all these cities, when I am showing you, they are interspersed in such a way that is a large city, a small city, a large city, a small city, a large city, a small city. And within a distance of 35 kilometers from each other, large city to small city, and from small city to the large city, about 30 to 35, on all over the coast. This is again Jaugarh. Then again we have the last is about Dantapura. This is again still remains in the name of Dantapura. It is one of the largest circular city in the country. It is 1.7 kilometer in diameter and has got about a moat about 90 meters. And close to it is the our Salihundam, or the kind of Kalingapatnam. The port is still known as Kalingapatnam, and I with Professor Basa, we have explored that area, and we have the similar kind of artifact antiquities which is coming from the lower level of Shishupalgarh or Lati or Talpada, dating back to the very early period which I will be showing to you. So this is where the Kalinga War begins. Then when we place the Kalinga War in our early historic urbanized period, is that the cities here are beginning around 8th century BC, and Kalinga War is coming much after that. We have about 400 years after the establishment of all the cities in the east coast is the Kalinga War coming. So we were not new to the Magadhan Empire and not new to the Eastern Indian cultural systems as such. This is where, then excavating at Shishupalgarh, we want to, when it comes to that Kalinga War turned the kind of cultural and religious system in the subcontinent, and went beyond the subcontinent to the Southeast Asia, then how it is, whether we have any kind of evidence as early as prior to the Ashokan invasion to the Kalinga, which can suggest that by then religion was playing a very important role, and probably it was it might have influenced in various ways or earlier prior to the Kalinga war to move out from this territory. This is an excavation which was carried out in 1952 by B.K. Thapar, the then Director General of Archaeological Survey, but never published it. Then when we were excavating at Shishpalgarh, we explored the area which is beyond the fortification. It's a huge, about 14 hectares of land, where we have the kind of sculptures which is quite similar to the Sanchi on the upper levels. But when we excavated the site, we had brick mud stupas. We know that when soon after the Ashoka's death, there were several, 8 stupas were constructed, and subsequently there were many stupas. Basically, they were constructed on mud. So this is one of the. There were several when we excavated. We found in this. I am showing a kind of sword which was inclining to the mud stupa. I am not calling it as Ashoka's sword because we don't have any proof to say that. But I will not hesitate to say that it was someone had surrendered the sword to the stupa. So we have in a limited area, we got about 3 mud stupas dating back to about middle of 4th, 5th century BC. Then we have cultural contact with the artifacts which we get. Is one of the important artifacts which has been always said is the rollated ware. So we get rollated ware from, it goes to about Gulf as Lake Berenice and to the, to the Gulf as such. But the process of its moving from the northern India to Sri Lanka to western India to Gulf is definitely suggest a kind of continuous cultural as well as trading contact within all the east coast as well as the western coast along with the Sri Lankan. So we see that related were in Orishan sites. We see them in Arikamedu. We see them in Sri Lanka. While excavating at Mantai, which the report has been published, I am one of the co-author in that. So we have the potteries which are going, this rollated ware goes from the northern India, and we have in Sri Lanka, we have in Arikamedu, we have in Mantai, we have in Anuradhapur, we have in Tesa Maharama, in almost all the sites in Sri Lanka, the early sites in Sri Lanka. Along with that, we have a grey ware which is little earlier, the one which is seeing on the top right. It comes from the northern India. It is a kind of late ware to the painted grey ware, and it also belongs to about 5th, 6th century BC. So it is reaching Mantai, and the one down below is the red polished ware which is coming from the western India, especially Gujarat or Rajasthan, etc. So by then, both the side is having contact. It is coming from western side and eastern. The far corner one is the NBPW, Northern Black Polished Ware, which is a very diagnostic ware. If it is found anywhere, we date about 6th, 6th century BC to about 2nd, 3rd century AD. So that it has been found at Mantai also. So it suggests that it is passing through these kinds of ports, and here is also Tesa Maharama you are getting. Besides that, when we come to the 1st, 2nd century AD, we have plenty of Roman coins appearing in western India and Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, we don't have much of the Roman coins appearing in archaeological context in our excavated site. But however, what we get is the bullae or the influence of Roman coins on kind of terracotta objects. So we have kind of pendants which is exactly replica of the Roman coins that appears in Radhanagar, that comes from Shishpalgarh, and we have got from all this. These are from Shishpalgarh exactly the replica. So that it is indirectly suggesting that the things which are not appearing in Indian Odissean context are coming through some cultural context which is reflected in a different kind of raw material found. So these are the kind of tree which we see that it's a kind of knobbed ware. We have plenty of knobbed ware coming from different parts of the East Coast, including the Southeast Asia also. We have some kind of coin impression, boat impressions and coins, so which comes from we are talking about Tamarlipti, is close to Chandrakatugad, which is in the part in the West Bengal itself, and the ports in the West Bengal and ports in Orissa coast were probably connected through the maritime activities. What we see here, besides this is a kind of pottery which is originating from the Roman Empire, and then we get the imitation of this in Sri Lanka and imitation of this in Shishpalgarh, and also in the Western India, also in the sites like Ter and Vakardan, etc. So the excavation at Manikpatna gave a kind of relationship, which we see that it's everybody knows in Orissa that Manikpatna is a kind of a port which had a contact with Sri Lanka. I excavated in 2011-12, and what we see here is the kind of ceramics, the Chinese ceramics, which are coming from China through the Southeast Asia, reaching to the East Coast, and then getting down to the Sri Lanka, and again reaching to the West Coast itself. So we see them, and these ceramics are from 10th century to 14th, 15th century. So that about 400, 500 years, the ships coming from China or through via are definitely reaching over Manikpatna, and then besides that we have Chinese coins and Sri Lankan coins appearing in Manikpatna. And what comparison we have now, all the Chinese ceramics that have been found in Manikpatna, you can see exactly same replica of the Chinese ceramics are appearing in Mantai. So at Manikpatna, besides this, we have the kind of ceramics coming from the west, like from Gulf. Then we have a conch shell manufacturing center at Manikpatna, which conchs were brought from Sri Lanka itself, because we don't have them in the East Coast itself. Then we excavated site called Gaurangpatna recently, last year, with Professor Kumbasa itself. There is a coral piece which don't have in the East Coast, so it comes from Sri Lankan coast itself. So we have this coral piece, can be dated about 4th, 5th century BC, is a very early phase of then we have a kind of cultural relationship. We can see that there is a kind of monkey and the crocodile story depicted in Mukteshwara temple, and the piece in the ceramics which you are seeing here, it comes from Mantai, which depicts the monkey and the crocodile story. And then besides that, we have the kinds of sheep-wrecks or the kind of giraffes coming. All these things might have come to the Sri Lankan ports and entering to the Eastern India. So a remnants of our cultural tradition. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one speaker for this session, Dr. Sheela Tripathi. He'll talk about maritime relations between Kalinga, Sri Lanka and Southeast Asian countries.
India is one of the oldest maritime country of the world, and in the 3rd century, in the 3500 years BP, the maritime system started from Harappan civilization, and this region was known as Melua, which has been inscribed in the Mesopotamian inscriptions, and Mesopotamian inscriptions is the only source which gives us the early contact of India with the Western world. 15 ports all along the east and west coast of India, which were started in different periods of history, and it is not that all the ports were existed in one time. After declining of one port, another port came to limelight, and this has been
the archaeological explorations and excavations have been confirmed to these statements. If we will look into the ports of Orissa, Bengal and Andhra, the thing is this, if we look into the maritime history of east coast of India, the ports of Bengal, Orissa, Andhra and Tamil Nadu have played a significant role in the maritime trade. And how these ports will interconnected, how the maritime trade was going on, I will be talking. In the maritime trade, monsoon wind has been played a major and active role. See, in ancient days there was no steam engine or mechanical systems. And if we will see the records, monsoon wind, which starts from the Southeast Asia, the summer monsoon, which is southwest monsoon, and the northeast monsoon is called summer, winter monsoon or trade winds. It has supported for sailing the ships. In those days, ships were sailed and the depiction of mast on the ships, which is the coins issued by the Satavahana dynasty, even in the Panchamar coins, found in Bengal coast, gives the indication that ships were sailed with the help of these winds. Scientifically, our institute has studied the southwest monsoon as well as the current. Both are, if you will see, July to December, November and December, and afterwards from January, October, November to up to February and March. The trader, it is not only the mariners of India, it is the mariners of the Red Sea coast also were following the same system. Now we are working, who were the real invaders, who were the real users of this monsoon wind. Okay. Whether it has been started from the Indians or what has recorded by Hippolus in 45 AD. That is the discovery of monsoon wind. Now we are working on it, but it seems that Indians, as far as our present study is concerned, the Indians are the real inventors of monsoon wind. No doubt, the mariners of east coast of India, along with Orissa and Bengal and Tamil Nadu and Andhra, they were using the monsoon wind to sail their ships to different parts of the world. See, there were 3 trade routes was start in the east coast of India, starting from Bengal to Tamil Nadu coast. The ships which were sailing from Tamralipti, they were coming up to Tamil Nadu, then they were going to Southeast Asia. Another trade system was there from Palu, and one more was from Andhra coast, Tamil Nadu coast, going up to Tamralipti, coming Burma, then to Southeast Asia. Okay. This is the region. During those days, the system was coastal hugging. The ships were not going straightly. The ship which was starting from Tamil was not at all going suddenly without stopping to Sri Lanka. No, it was coming. That's what whenever we will see the Buddhist side of west coast of India and central India as well as this southern coast of India, see, they were coming all the way to their nearest port and they were exchanging their cargo and they were taking the cargo which was available from these ports to their region. And we know that the Kartika Purnima festival and all those things, and this Kartika Purnima is being celebrated throughout the India in different names. See, in Punjab they celebrate in Andhra Pradesh, in Tamil Nadu, even in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Cambodia, Bali. Okay, and in India, I mean in Orissa, we celebrate in this way. But in Bali and other parts, the Hindus they celebrate, but little bit in different way. See, these are the type of boats and ships were found and recorded from the pottery as well as the sea. See, this is from the Red Sea coast, and this is from the Tamil Nadu, and these are from Orissa, and this is from Sri Lanka. This is from Vietnam, these are from Thailand, and this is from Socotra Island in the Red Sea coast. The thing is, these ships Only these are the evidences we have regarding the ancient kind of ships which were used in the maritime trade of early historical period. Who were the traders and who were organizing this maritime trade? See, all along the east coast and west coast of India, we have number of Buddhist sites, and along with Hindu traders, Buddhist mariners, Buddhist monks, and Buddhist people, they were the real traders. And the Buddhism has not only gone from to our Sri Lanka, it has gone to Sweden in 5th century AD, and it has gone to Maldives. This is from Lakshadweep, and this is from Java, and these are from Odisha. So it shows that the maritime, along with the maritime trade, the Buddhist mariners has played a major role. That's what we have remains of Buddhism all along the Indian subcontinent, along with our European countries. But one thing, we have so much contact with the Red Sea coast and Southeast Asia, but so far we do not have any evidence from the Red Sea coast. I will show you in my subsequent slide what kind of evidences we have from the Red Sea coast and as well as Southeast Asia, but probably the people of Southeast Asia found it is a good religion and all other things they took into account and they embraced Buddhism. Probably the Red Sea coast people, they were not so much about the religion, they were more about the business. So we do not have any kind of evidence. But in addition to this, we have a lot of new archaeological evidences are coming from Red Sea coast, including sails and Indian pottery, graffiti marks. These are the Buddhist sites from Odisha and Andhra and Tamil Nadu, and we have the evidences of Buddhism. See, we do not know where is Dantapura. And to be very honest, people are the scholars of Odisha, they call Palluri as a Dantapur, which is Jantilika. No. Dantapura is in Kalingapatnam near. During excavation I had participated. We have 3 to 4 stupas they have exposed. On the other side of the stupa, river Vanshadhara is flowing. Okay? And we have the pottery which are similar with the other sides of early historical sites of Odisha, that is Noblewear and all those things. And this we have, early historical period, that is 6th century BC. After Harappan period, another system of culture, the development of permanent settlement, industry, economy, metal technology is coming from during 6th century BC onwards, and along with that period, we are having one pottery called NBP. Okay. This pottery, we can see their distribution from, almost all east coast of India and west coast of India. It has been recorded from 415 sites along the Indian coast. But so far, I think except Sri Lanka, we do not have any evidence of NBP, other parts of the world. But as far as Rollettenberg is concerned, these are the northern pottery. Even NBP has got paintings, and this is from Tisarama of Sri Lanka, and this is Alangankulam. Coming to Rollettenberg, see, we have lot of, after NBP, Rollettenberg is the bear which moved along with the mariners. Okay. So there are mostly 215 sites on the Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and India Rollettenberg. In addition to these things, we have the evidences of Rollettenberg in Red Sea coast, Oman, Persian Gulf and Southeast Asia. So it clearly shows, along with the mariners, how this pottery has played an important role for the, which provides a contact between India and Southeast Asia as well as the Red Sea coast. These are the recent excavations of Red Sea coast as brought to light textiles. The analysis of textiles shows that either it is from Bengal or from Odisha. and these are the sails, and you can see the spastic mark pottery. These are the net carriers. These are the remains of the sails brails, and this you can see this is the original thread, cotton thread, still is preserved, found in Red Sea coast, Berenike and Maya Hormuz. Okay, coming to Orissa and this one, besides our NBP and related ware, recently one more pottery on which we are working along with Dr. Sunil Patnaik, Subrat Acharya and others, and Professor Mohanty has also worked. Now I am thinking these related ware, it earlier during excavations of Jaugarh and Sispargarh, for the first time it was reported. Then subsequent to excavations by at Orishan sites, Vidyadharpur and Radhanagar, is yielded a related ware. But no doubt this is from Arika Medu and this is from Hastinapur and this is from Budhyagara of Western Orissa. When I read the published sources of Arika Medu and Hastinapur, they have mentioned that pottery has knob, but they have mentioned that it could have influence with Roman or European contact. But no doubt the related ware, the knobbed ware probably originated in Orissa, because all these pot sets, if you will see, we have some kind of a graffiti marks. And this is from Tamil Nadu. You can see the graffiti mark which are resembling with the graffiti marks of Orissa and Kalingapatnam. We have done the XRD analysis of this knobbed ware. These marks which are the quartz remains, but wherever we have not marked, that is the thing which can lead to draw the conclusion about the original source of the pottery. In Indian coast we find pottery, in the Indian coast we find the pottery with, clay pottery, but in Southeast Asia, particularly from Thailand, we have found bronze, high tin bronze ceramics, and these pottery are associated with Buddhism, and Professor Ian Glover has identified to these peaks as the Mount Meru and to these circles as the waves of the sea associated with Buddhism. In addition to Thailand, these are from Mahastanagarh and Bari Bateshwar of Bangladesh. This is from Vietnam, and these are from Sri Lanka. See, these are line pendants found in Thailand, and these are called Sakya Sima, the earlier form of Buddhism. And India has got, see why we do not have lot of material, Orissa and Sri Lankan contact. Probably I feel that that was the initial stage. When the time passes, the technology develops, and once the technology develops, we will have more and more finished things. So in 4th, 5th century AD, 3rd century AD, we have lot of things, semi-precious stone artifacts, which has come from the Thailand and Malaysia and this Indonesia. See, these are from Indonesia, and you see that Triratna from Bharut sculpture and the Triratna from Thailand. This is the recent finding from a shipwreck in Thailand, and here you see the inscription is written Matihara, but this is from West Coast, and the pottery, this pottery is called torpedo jar. But interesting thing is this, the shipwreck, this is the construction of the shipwreck of Thailand, and the construction pattern, the swing system is resembling with our Orishan type. So probably the ship is Orishan, and the material was going, as I had told you, that a number of traders were coming from different parts of India. They meet at a particular port, then they go to different parts. That was the exchange of system. So probably this could be a evidence with India and Thailand. And this is from Vietnam, Maldives. Okay, coming to Orissa and Sri Lanka, 2 minutes.
I think you should wind up now because...
2 minutes. This is, no, the thing is this, Orissa and Andhra, Orissa and Sri Lanka, I am going to provide some new information. Yes. See, the earlier study shows that ecologically, Orissa in prehistoric times, Orissa and Sri Lanka are similar in terms of the cultivation, and if we look into the type of sails, planking, boat planking, and the outrigger system, they had almost all similar India and Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Even the technical terms related to the navigation and maritime trade is also resembling. The people of northern Sri Lanka, called Polindas, they were using the script called Damili in 5th, 6th century BC, 4th, 5th century BC, and the Damili people were from Bihar and Orissa region. This is the new information is coming from Anuradhapur. This is the earliest, particularly archaeological evidence. And in addition to that, we have the inscriptional evidence where we have clearly mentioned about the Kalinga mariners in Southeast Asia and South Asia. There is this Chula, Kalinga Jataka is known to everybody, but one thing is there, when Ashoka sent the Buddhist tree to Devanampiya Tisha, he accepted it. In return, what he gave? He sent the precious stones to King Ashoka. Okay. This is also because even till today, the semi-precious stones, the pearls, are highly respectable and highly demand in of Sri Lanka in other parts of the world. In India, as far as marine archaeology is concerned, we have explored and excavated a number of sites, and coming to Orissa coast, we have found a shipwreck in Konark coast, and last year me and my colleagues were exploring off Konark coast. We have located a shipwreck, and the shipwreck is here, is around 4-5 kilometers from Konark. And the records suggest that the shipwreck of Konark, what we have found is a steam engine ship, but the records suggest that there is one ship called Charon, which is of 17th, 16th, 17th century, is wrecked off Konark. That means, as far as this archival sources is concerned, there is ship Charon is wrecked, and the wreck what we have located is the steam engine ship. And similarly, the Godavaya shipwreck of Sri Lanka has brought to light lot of evidences of Indian, which is the 1st, 2nd century BC, and this is the first shipwreck of Godavaya in Sri Lanka, which is the earliest so far in South Asia. And here you see, almost this we have found from Kalingapatnam in Andhra Pradesh. Here you see, this is the stone bench they call from Godabaya, and here you can see the symbols. Okay, and this is from Tismara, and these are from Kalingapatnam. See the similarity about the pottery. But the interesting thing is this: these Nandipada and the Triratna symbols, which are depicted or inscribed on these swords related to Buddhism. And we have similar kind of thing from Kalingapatnam. One more interesting thing about Indian contact with Sri Lanka is in the shipwreck, 1885, Alexander Cunningham, the then governor, the Director General of ASI, has taken almost everything of the Bharut Stupa in a shipwreck, the ship wrecked in this part of Sri Lanka, and now the Sri Lankan maritime archaeologists are undertaking this.
Tripathi, may I request you to wind up now?
My purpose of showing the slides is the work what we have done in NIO Goa and what we are looking for at Orissa is that a joint collaboration, because see we have not so far located the ports, and we know the reason why the ports are extended because of the geological processes, and So, if we have a collaboration with the Institute Southeast Asia and other institute of Odisha, then we can bring to the limelight, and this is the only thing, then we can reconstruct the contact between one part to another part. Unless coastal exploration or underwater excavation, it will be very difficult, and I do not know, or I feel the sources what is mentioned in literature, we have to relook into it before constructing the history. Thank you.
It's been a long day, and I know that we've had a number of very outstanding experts in their respective fields who have spoken to us. But this is part of the learning process. We've got to the experts from different specializations. There have been experts on political history, there have been experts on linguistics, there have been experts on archaeology and specializing in marine archaeology. So they have a lot to share with us, but unfortunately we have a limited time, not only to listen to them, but also to absorb the amount of information that we are getting. I have a request for our very learned scholars here. We are trying to establish the connections between Lanka and Kalinga. Therefore, kindly focus on this issue, because there is a wealth of information, but where we have large gaps and where we need to know more about is what are those connections, and tell us from the archaeological to the political to the linguistic areas where were the connections that we have missed so far. And that is where we are seeking enlightenment, because there is so much, obviously so much of research being done, that it is impossible to pack them into these very limited sessions. So I'm pleading with our presentators to have very short focused presentations focusing on Kalinga and Lanka, and not the much wider field, which of course can be discussed at some other time. We have some mementos for our distinguished guests from Sri Lanka, and bear with us for a few minutes. First, I would like to request His Excellency the High Commissioner, Mr. S.L.R. Veerakun, to kindly come and accept a very token gift from us. Professor Anoma Averatne, please. Professor Koperheva. Professor Anuram Manadunga. Professor B.D. Nandadeva. Mr. Roshan Vijayasekara.